Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce observed a deeply disturbing situation outside a Kansas City residential complex when they witnessed law enforcement officers targeting an elderly military veteran in what appeared to be a standard identification verification. However, the subsequent treatment and Travis's immediate intervention would elevate veteran advocacy issues to unprecedented public attention. On a tranquil Sunday afternoon in Kansas City, Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce were heading to meet one of Travis's former football colleagues who lived in a modest apartment community situated in the eastern part of the city. Marcus had invited them for an informal backyard gathering, and they anticipated spending a peaceful day with friends removed from constant public scrutiny. Taylor expressed her admiration for Marcus's residential choice as Travis positioned their car in the guest parking section, noting how the neighborhood felt authentically normal and community-centered while watching various families outdoors, enjoying the favorable weather conditions. The residential complex bustled with characteristic Sunday afternoon energy as young children played enthusiastically in the central courtyard space. Families operated outdoor cooking equipment on their individual balcony areas, and senior residents occupied scattered benches throughout the grounds while absorbing the pleasant spring warmth. Marcus had deliberately mentioned his preference for living somewhere that preserved genuine community atmosphere. Travis explained while retrieving the homemade dessert Taylor had created for the social gathering, mentioning that Marcus had been raised in comparable neighborhoods and wished to maintain those foundational connections. As they proceeded through the complex toward Marcus's residential building, they detected various sounds of families celebrating their weekend leisure time together, including musical entertainment from different apartments, children's laughter echoing throughout the playground area, and the collective energy of a unified community sharing quality moments together. Nevertheless, as they approached the corner leading to Building C, the entire environmental mood transformed dramatically and alarmingly. Two uniformed law enforcement officials had stopped an elderly gentleman positioned beside the entrance to one of the apartment buildings. The individual appeared to be approximately in his late 60s with silver hair and a slight posture that indicated decades of physically demanding work experience. He wore neat but visibly aged clothing including tan trousers and a collared shirt, and he carried a small shopping bag containing recent grocery purchases. One officer was insisting on seeing identification documents as Travis and Taylor approached within audible range of the confrontation, while the elderly gentleman responded that he resided in the building and had simply returned from a store visit. The second officer interrupted with considerably more aggressive communication than his colleague's method, stressing that the individual must immediately present identification when any police officer makes such demands. Taylor and Travis intentionally reduced their walking speed as both detected something fundamentally inappropriate about the specific encounter between law enforcement and the resident. The elderly gentleman addressed the officers while carefully reaching into his rear pocket, explaining that he possessed his driver's license, but required clarification about why they were detaining him since he had committed no violations. The first officer stated they had received a report concerning suspicious behavior in the vicinity, and that someone fitting the gentleman's appearance had been seen acting unusually near the residential structures. Travis and Taylor shared concerned expressions because the someone matching your description rationale appeared extremely vague, and the elderly gentleman scarcely seemed like an individual who would participate in any suspicious activities. The individual explained that he had resided in the building for a full decade and that every community member knew him personally, specifically mentioning Mrs. Patterson from Unit 2B who had acknowledged him merely 5 minutes prior. The second officer directed the gentleman to remain calm, moving closer while asserting that his distress was complicating the situation's resolution. Travis observed that the gentleman wasn't displaying hostile agitation but was becoming progressively upset, and certain aspects of his physical behavior indicated he was experiencing some form of psychological crisis or anxiety reaction. The gentleman suddenly announced that he had served his country militarily, his voice breaking emotionally, clarifying that he had completed 3 combat tours in Vietnam and shouldn't need to validate his right to exist in his own residential area. Travis immediately recognized the gentleman's hands beginning to tremble visibly and his respiration becoming quick and shallow, and as someone who had acquired understanding about PTSD through his comprehensive involvement with veteran support organizations, Travis identified the unmistakable indicators of someone undergoing a panic episode or traumatic stress response. Travis approached the gathering and courteously interrupted while indicating that the gentleman might be experiencing a medical emergency requiring prompt care. Both officers shifted to observe Travis, and one immediately identified him, with the first officer recognizing Travis Kelce and inquiring about his presence in this specific area. Travis responded that he was visiting acquaintances, but stressed that his current priority concerned the elderly gentleman who was now supporting himself against the building wall and obviously struggling with breathing and emotional stability. Travis directly asked the gentleman about his condition, and the individual looked upward with combined bewilderment and appreciation, explaining that his breathing felt restricted and that the uniforms triggered memories he couldn't articulate completely. Travis compassionately inquired whether he served in Vietnam, and the gentleman managed to introduce himself as Frank Rodriguez from the 1st Infantry Division, who had served military duty from 1968 through 1971. Subscribe to discover how Travis's upcoming revelation would uncover months of systematic intimidation that had been directed toward Frank and other veterans throughout the community. Taylor had approached their group and could clearly recognize that Frank was experiencing authentic distress, so she communicated gently with him, assuring him of his safety and location in his own neighborhood while guiding him through controlled breathing exercises. The officers observed this interaction, displaying obvious confusion, combined with what appeared to be mild embarrassment, with the second officer defensively claiming they were merely conducting standard verification based on a received complaint. Travis questioned what type of complaint they had received, maintaining respectful but determined communication, because Frank had indicated that he lived in the building and was only returning from a grocery shopping trip. The first officer responded that they didn't require civilian involvement in official police operations, and Travis clarified that this represented community concern rather than interference, emphasizing that Frank was clearly experiencing a medical crisis requiring assistance rather than continued questioning. Frank's breathing pattern started improving, but he remained visibly disturbed, and he quietly informed Travis and Taylor that identical situations occurred monthly, with officers stopping him, requesting identification, and compelling him to demonstrate his residential rights, with each encounter mentally transporting him back to his military combat experiences. Taylor asked with obvious anger whether this happened every month, and Frank confirmed that sometimes the identical two officers were involved while other times different personnel appeared, but the narrative remained consistent, involving reports of suspicious activity and identification requirements. Travis directly questioned the officers about whether Frank was recognized by their department and if he had any arrest record or criminal charges, and following an exchange of glances between officers, the first admitted they weren't aware of any such incidents. Travis continued pressing, questioning why they repeatedly stopped and verified identification of a law-abiding citizen and military veteran based on what specific evidence or justification. The officers maintained that they respond to receive calls, and Taylor asked who had contacted them that day and what precisely had been reported as suspicious behavior. The officers appeared obviously uncomfortable with these direct inquiries, claiming they couldn't disclose details regarding active investigations, but Travis emphasized that this wasn't an investigation but harassment that triggered PTSD episodes in a Vietnam veteran. At this point, additional residents had started gathering around the disturbance, and an elderly African-American woman approached the group, completely disregarding the police officers while asking Frank about his well-being. Frank replied that he was managing despite being obviously shaken, and Mrs. Patterson addressed the officers with a stern demeanor, questioning why they were troubling Frank again since this represented the fourth occurrence during the current year. The first officer started explaining their response to calls, but Mrs. Patterson interrupted, asking what calls they referenced since she had lived in the complex for 15 years and Frank was their most considerate and peaceful neighbor, assisting elderly residents with grocery transport, supervising children during outdoor play, and never creating any disturbances. More residents joined the gathering and voiced similar positive opinions about Frank, with a younger Hispanic gentleman stating that Frank was an excellent person who had repaired his automobile the previous month without accepting compensation, and a young mother with a small child mentioned that Frank consistently delivered soup to her grandmother during illness. Travis understood that Frank wasn't simply a complex resident, but was genuinely a treasured and respected community member, and the police harassment wasn't exclusively affecting Frank, but was influencing everyone who valued him.